The 1999 NATO onslaught against Yugoslavia saw the targeting of civilian infrastructure, the bombing of radio television Serbia, the use of cluster bombs, and even depleted uranium.
You think a media outlet is a legitimate target?
No, but when it's used as command and control, it is.
Even if it kills makeup
wait a minute.
artists.
You have to let me finish. And then,
Go ahead.
You can finish. But what I said was we would give them the warnings. It was part of their command and control system. It was approved as a legitimate target under the laws of land warfare. And it went through the U.S. government. I mean, I respect Amnesty International. I think they're a good organization, but
we only care what human rights organizations have to say when they're slamming our enemies. Maybe that's how he wished he could have ended that sentence. Well, in that same conflict, NATO hit a passenger train and later got tangled up in damage control explanations.
First of all, the passenger train was not targeted. The pilot's instructions were to go after a bridge and not the train. He felt as he launched that missile that all of a sudden, at the very last minute, the train suddenly came into his field of view. But whatever it was going faster than the actual speed.
What the actual in real-time speed showed was that the pilot actually moved the target so that it would hit the train.
Well, I don't have that
and 12
information.
people were killed.
Of course he doesn't. The 78-day military campaign ended with thousands of deaths and injuries, tens of thousands of houses destroyed, as well as hundreds of kilometers of roads and railway, airports, hospitals, schools, cultural monuments, even the building of the Chinese embassy, where 3 Chinese journalists were killed and dozens injured. A terrible tragedy, or no more than collateral damage, as the U.S. likes to call it. Well, a UN report later showed that NATO also used cluster bombs in an area with no military objectives.
The use of the Orkan rocket with a cluster bomb warhead was not designed to hit military targets but to terrorize the civilians of Zagreb.
Another case of appalling tactics in action. The 43-day air bombardment of Iraq during Operation Desert Storm. Precision-guided weapons targeted electrical plants, oil refineries, and transportation networks. This led to acute malnutrition and epidemic levels of cholera and typhoid, with Harvard researchers forecasting that at least 170,000 children under 5 years of age will die in the coming year from the delayed effects of the bombing. But civilian suffering didn't seem to bother Washington at the time. According to the U.S. Air Force, Iraqi civilians were apparently not innocent because they supported their government.
The definition of innocence gets to be a little bit unclear. They do live there, and ultimately the people have some control over what goes on in their country.
That sure sounds like civilians were fair game. Around 200,000 Iraqis were killed by direct violence since the U.S. invasion. Plus, the unnecessary devastation they left behind affected millions of others, and questions regarding the necessity to target certain places remain.
Airstrikes on civilian power facilities in al-Nasiriyah caused serious civilian suffering, and the legality of the attacks on media installations is questionable. Human Rights Watch does not understand the military necessity and rationale for these attacks and calls on the United States to explain them fully. The attacks caused significant and long-term damage, and the civilian cost was high. The loss of power was a huge impediment to the proper treatment of war wounded. The loss of power created a water crisis in the city.
Afghanistan 2015. Repeated U.S. airstrikes destroy the trauma hospital run by Doctors Without Borders in Kunduz. 42 people were killed in the attack, including patients, caretakers, and MSF staff members. The Pentagon said it was not a war crime. It was unintentional, a tragic strike that was due to human and technical errors. Well, here's another error. 10 civilians, including 7 children, who were killed in their home last year after the U.S. intelligence mistook an innocent Afghan who worked for a food NGO for an ISIS member. A tragic mistake is what they called it, and a subsequent Air Force review of the circumstances around the strike found, you guessed it, no violation of law, including the law of war. Libya was another country to face NATO's wrath. At some point, they debilitated the country's water system by targeting critical installations, including a water pipe factory in Brega. They claimed it was Gaddafi's military storage facility concealing rocket launchers. But when asked to provide evidence, NATO satellite images showed that one rocket launcher identified near the facility days earlier was still there, perfectly intact after the NATO attack. So what was the point in that? The disruption of the GMR left 4 million Libyans without drinking water. Appalling tactics indeed. Now, these are just a few examples of NATO's and Washington's military approach and errors. The only problem is that very few dare to call them out on their epic blunders, no matter how many lives are taken as a result. And now they have the nerve to call out Russia for targeting critical infrastructure in Ukraine when that's the West's go-to strategy each and every time. The double standards continue.